It's 12.
We're live now.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for joining us. I'm Beth Keene, CEO of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We are honored to have two distinguished guests, both of whom I adore and are longtime members of the museum community. Leslie Gilbert-Lurie is a writer, lawyer, former television executive, and philanthropist. She is a member of the International Board of Directors of Human Rights Watch, where she is chair of the Nominating and Governance Committee. She is a founding board member and past board chair of the Alliance for Children's Rights and a member of the UCLA Foundation Board of Directors, as well as the UCLA Medical Center and UCLA Law School Board of Advisors. Leslie's mother, Rita Laurie, who currently resides in Los Angeles, was 5 years old when she was forced to flee her home in Poland to hide from the Nazis. For nearly 2 years, she and 14 family members hid in a cramped, dark attic during the Holocaust. Leslie and Rita co-authored the highly acclaimed memoir, Bending Toward the Sun, which brings together the stories of Rita, Leslie, and Leslie's daughter, Michaela, and reveals how deeply the Holocaust lives in the hearts and minds of survivors and their descendants. When I read the book, I couldn't put it down because it was the first book I had read about the Holocaust that was through the lens of 3 generations. And as the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, it resonated with me in so many ways. Leslie and Rita will answer questions at the end of their presentation. So if you have any questions, please type them in the comment box. And with that, it is my pleasure to now hand it over to my friend, Leslie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Beth. And we adore you too, and are so proud of everything that you have created in our building at the Museum of the Holocaust.
Well,
And in fact, the Museum of the Holocaust holds a very special place in my mom's and my heart because we did a book event there, I think right after the museum reopened. And this is not a spoiler alert, but after my mother first came to this country, she met a best friend in middle school. And during the whole time that we were writing this book, I couldn't reach the friend who I wanted to get comments on for our book. I couldn't figure out where to find her. And when we showed up at the Museum of the Holocaust, right after our book came out, that friend was there to say hi to my mother. So she said, Rita, do you know who I am? And so they reunited. So that's my first memory of the Museum of the Holocaust. It's a pleasure to be here. And I wanted to tell you all a little bit about my mother's story, how we came to write our book. And my mother then is going to read you a couple pages of our book in her own words. And our favorite part is to answer your questions at the end, to talk about the relevance of the Holocaust to the world today, to talk about book writing and the transmission of trauma. So please ask us any questions that you have. My mother was born in 1937 in Poland in a small village called Ujowice. She remembers, there you see it with the red X on the map. It's near the southeast corner of Poland. It wasn't far from the Russian border. And my mother remembers her early years as being very happy. She had her father, you could see in the picture, her mother, her older sister, Sandra, who was a year and a half older than she was. And then eventually she also had a baby brother. She lived in a small sort of farm-like village, and she remembers playing in front of her home and having her cousins live down the street. Her father was one of 13 siblings, so she largely remembers, most of her memories are the holidays, either Shabbat, Friday night celebrations, or Passover and the larger Jewish holidays, celebrating with her larger family. You could see in these photos, this is a trip, that's my sister and me. We went back to Poland in our 20s, which I'll tell you a little more about later. But those are pictures of my mother's home 30 years after she had left, but that's the village of Ujovice. That's the feel of the village. In 1942, in the winter of 1942, my mother remembers looking out of her kitchen window one day. She was then just before she turned 4.5 years old. She remembers looking out of her kitchen window one day and seeing Nazi tanks roll by her kitchen window. And as we were writing this book, my mother told me that at that moment, at 4.5 years old, everything inside of her froze. She had the feeling that her life again would never again be the same. Shortly after that, her family received an edict to report to the local train station. And they had to make a decision whether to follow that order or not. My mother's family, her parents, her aunts and uncles and grandparents got together and tried to decide if they should follow the order or not. Ultimately, they did not follow the order. When I asked our relatives, one of the things that's very unique about this memoir, one thing that's very unique is it involves my mother and 15 members of her family hiding in one attic for 2 years. That's very unusual. It was very unusual for a large group to hide together. And it was very unusual for a group to stay in one place for 2 years. But also, our book doesn't just rely on my mother's memory. It's my mother, her sister, 3 cousins, 2 uncles, all of who had this similar experience. And we interviewed all of them to write this book. So when I asked my mother's relatives, why did you even question reporting to the train station? They had different recollections. Some thought maybe it's because they saw other villagers get on those trains and not come back, or they had started to hear rumors. At this point, this was winter of 1942, right after the Wannsee Conference, when the Nazis had all gotten together in January of 1942 and decided upon the final solution, and that people would get on trains and go to concentration camps. So maybe they had heard these rumors. My mother's cousin Sally said she thought that her father had the idea not to get on the trains, because in her house, Sally was 3 years older than my mother. She lived down the street, and stationed in their home were Nazi soldiers, 3 Nazi soldiers. One of those Nazi soldiers, Mr. Arnold, used to wait for Sally's father, my mother's uncle Leibisch, to get home from work, and they would play chess together. And Sally said, Mr. Arnold probably said, don't trust those Nazis, don't take them at their word. So maybe he tipped off my mother's family. As you all know, the Nazis used 2 main weapons to fight the Holocaust, right? The Holocaust was a war within a war, small war, the Holocaust within World War II, just as the Armenian genocide, right, was a small war within World War I, a smaller war. So the Nazis used 2 weapons to fight this war within a war. They used what? Force and propaganda. So the Nazis didn't send my mother's family an order and say, report to the local train station where you're going to get on a train and go to Auschwitz and be killed when you get off the train. Instead, they said, report at this time on this day, pack this bag, stay together with your family for when you're relocated at the other end. They always used euphemisms, right? Like nice words to say really horrible things. My mother's family decided not to report to the train station. Instead, on a very dark night, they packed up their belongings in a little knapsack and they just left home. They didn't know where they were going. Their larger family decided to split into smaller groups. Why? Probably so if one group was caught, others might survive. And not surprisingly, the other members of my mother's family didn't want to be with the group with little kids. So my mother's family was her brother, her sister, her parents, and her cousins who lived down the street. There was Sally, Miriam, and Lola. They were 9, 7, and 5. And then there were 2 infant babies and their parents. And then my mother was just about to turn 5. Her sister was 7, and she had a baby brother. This group left home, and for the next 6 weeks, they hid in forests and ditches. There were a lot of farms in this part of Poland. Sometimes they would see haystacks on farms, and they would pull out the hay. My mother's cousin Sally, years later, is showing us how they did that. They would pull out the hay from these haystacks, and sometimes they would even sleep in these haystacks. During the day, they would hide out in them. Sometimes Polish farmers would even walk by and just look the other way. But my mother's family knew that they had to find somewhere safer to hide. First of all, they had little children. Children make noise. This was Poland. In the winter, it would get very, very cold. They couldn't just be out in the elements. Already the infant cousins who were with them, one had to be brought and left on a church doorstep before they even started. And a few weeks later, they brought the other baby to a church step. So they had to think of someone who might help them, somewhere safer they could hide. And they thought of Staszek Grocholski. Staszek was a farmer. He lived nearby. He had grown up next to my mother's grandfather and her family. They knew he was a good person. And they got word to him when they were hiding outside in the elements. And he would sneak out sometimes on dark nights and bring them little bits of food, little bits of news. And they said, please, could we hide in your home for a night or two? At first he said no. He said, my wife won't allow it. But one night, because what was the punishment for helping a Jewish family in Poland at that time? It was death, right? So that was a huge risk when he had 4 children of his own. But one night, Staszek snuck out to the fields where they were hiding, and he said, okay, you could come to my home. Years later, we met Maria Grocholski and the Staszek's wife, and we said, why did you ever change your mind? Why did you say yes and let my mother's family come to your home? And she said she was so afraid that her husband would get shot sneaking out to these forests and farms by what she called a trigger happy Pole. So she said my mother's family could come there for a few days. So on a dark night, my mother's family snuck over to his house. They climbed up a ladder and they went into an attic. Here you could see, this is my sister on the left climbing up those stairs years later. And that's Maria Grocholski on the right, talking to my mother's cousin Sally, also on our same visit back there. But that's what the attic looked like. There were wooden slats. You could see little bits of light coming in. The attic was only 4 feet high. It was very small. I always forget the dimensions because I'm so bad at this, but it was something like 14 feet by 10 feet. I'll get the exact dimensions. But life in the attic was very, very difficult. In the summer, it was really, really hot there. And even though there was a well right outside of their farm, my mother's family could not go down and get water during the day because they were always afraid that a Nazi would see them. Nazis would come by this farm regularly to get cheese and milk and provisions. So they were always afraid they would be noticed. In fact, the children were not even allowed to talk in the attic. If a child in the attic cried, Maria Grocholski told us she would hit one of her own children so that their cries downstairs might cover up any noise upstairs. In the winter, it was freezing cold in the attic. There was snow right outside, and there was only straw on the floor. So, and even though the Grocholski family would bring up food at the beginning, little bits of food, they were rationed. So it was never very much food. But after a while, the Gracholskis were very afraid that my mother's family were up there. So they barely brought any food. My mother's uncles and father would sneak out when they could at night. Sometimes they'd pick fruit, vegetables from the trees or the farms, especially in the spring and summer. Occasionally a neighbor would leave out little bits of food, but life in the attic was very, very difficult. And now this is my mother, Rita, and she's going to read you 2 pages of her words from our book, Bending Toward the Sun. Hi, Mom.
Hi. God, why? Why are you doing this? Aunt Sylvia asked tearfully in the dark one night. My uncles had asked the same question, but I never heard an answer. Tato, why isn't God helping us? I managed to ask my father the next morning after watching him go through his religious ritual. So we still believe in God, right? I asked. Of course. My father never lost faith. His morning and evening prayers probably helped him to keep some sense of order and feel in control of at least the spiritual part of his life. I was still confused about God's role, but I didn't want to ask too many questions. By early 1944, we had been in the attic for more than a year and a half. My brother Nachum, then 5, became very ill with dehydration, malnutrition, and probably lack of stimulation. He lay helplessly in a corner and weakly cried, Mama. I don't think he had ever been seen by a doctor. One morning, I awoke to a lot of commotion. He can't be dead, my mother sobbed, cradling my brother in her arms. Nachum, wake up, little baby. The adults were crying hysterically. My father was trying to comfort my mother. Dad, what did that mean? My brother couldn't be gone. It was incomprehensible to me. As Uncle Max took Nachum's lifeless body out of my mother's trembling arms, I closed my eyes and pretended that what was happening was not real. Nachum's death left 13 of us in the attic, at least for the time being.
Thanks, Mom. Shortly after my mother's brother died, something else very sad happened also. My mother's family had continued to celebrate Shabbat in the attic. They would at least light a match and quickly blow it out, or sometimes a candle, but they were always worried about fire since there was straw in the attic and it was a wood structure, so they were careful about it. My mother remembers one Sunday, one evening with her family gathered around her in a semicircle. She remembers her mother looking at each member of the family, and then her mother put her head down and she died also. So, oh, and I neglected to tell you a very important part of the story. In addition to the 10 people I told you about being in the attic, the reason there were 15 people in the attic and then finally 13 was 4 of my mother's single cousins. Right when my mother got up to the attic, 4 of her uncles who were in their early 20s and teenagers found my mother's family, and they came up to the attic too. So that's what made such a large group in the attic. Now my mother's mother had died and her younger brother had died, and other people were getting sicker and sicker, including my mom. Finally, in July of 1944, exactly 2 years after my mother's family had gone into the attic, Stasha Gracholski came up to the attic one day and he said, "The war is over, you're free to leave." Now, as you all know, the war did not end in the summer of 1944, but apparently the Gracholskis and others around there thought that it was safe enough that the Russians and the Allied forces had pushed the Germans far enough west that my mother's family could come down out of the attic. My mother's family slowly made their way down. The children couldn't even walk because they had not moved in so long. They were wearing the exact same clothes they wore into the attic because they hadn't grown or gained any weight at all in that time, in the 2 years. But they slowly made their way down out of the attic. They thanked the Gracholski family. They promised them that they would never tell anyone where they had hidden. And slowly they made their way back home. As they were walking back home, the 3 or 4 miles away, they could hear fighting all around them. The Russians and Germans were still shooting at each other as my mother's family was walking back home. They met a Russian soldier along the way, a Jewish Russian soldier, and he gave them some advice. He said, he helped lead them home. He said, careful, don't look into the sun because you could get blind. You've been in the dark for so long. And he suggested they start to eat very slowly because they hadn't eaten any significant amount of food in those 2 years. My mother's family got back to their home and her cousins to their home. When my mother looked at her home, it just looked like a shell of itself. It didn't look anything like she remembered it. All the furniture was gone, the curtains were gone. But for the next few weeks, they tried to resume their life. Her father and her uncles tried to figure out a way to start working again. My mother was very sick. It turned out she had tuberculosis and rickets, but they tried to start a life over again. They came across some old friends as they were back home. One day, my mother's uncle Max was out in the street and someone came up to him, an old friend, and he said, "Where did you hide during the war?" Uncle Max said, "Well, I'm not going to tell you." And the man said, "You don't have to tell me. I'll tell you. You hid at the Gracholski's home." Uncle Max said, "Why would you say that?" And the man said, "Well, during the winter, when there was snow on all the other roofs in the village, there wasn't snow on half of the Gracholski's roof, like where my mother's family was hiding in the attic." So that made us think that a village really did help keep my mother's family secret. A few weeks later, there was another knock on the door. And it was an old friend of my grandfather's. He said, "Remember years ago, or remember a long time ago, I told you that I would do you a big favor one day?" And my grandfather said yes. And he said, "Well, I'm doing you a favor of a lifetime. Do not go to sleep in your home tonight, or no one's going to wake up in the morning." And it turned out that my mother's family was aware there was still a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland, even once the Nazis left. And my mother's family took this man at his word. They once again packed up their belongings, this time never to return, and they left their home. For the next 5 years, my mother's family went from country to country to country, trying to figure out what country would allow them to stay. They wound up in Italy. My mother spent a year in a hospital, in a sanitarium where nuns and doctors nursed her back to health because she did have tuberculosis and rickets. After that, she rejoined her family in a displaced persons camp in Italy. By that time, that's my mother in the left corner with her sister, and her father got remarried in this displaced persons camp. You could see them in the photo right underneath my mother and her sister and the baby. He married a woman named Clara, my mother's stepmother, and my mother never ended up having a good relationship with Clara, but Clara also is interviewed and has a chapter devoted to her in our story. That's my mother and her sister right after the war, and that's her larger family with some of her uncles. My mother's in the bottom right-hand corner, and they spent close to 4 years in this one in Italy in displaced persons camp, 5 years overall in displaced persons camps. Waiting for some relative, someone to let them come to her country, to their country. I think there's one more photo beneath of my mother. Here she is. She's the second one from the left, and she's marching on the day of Israel's Declaration of Independence in Italy we actually went back to Italy for my mother's 80th birthday 2 years ago and stood in this exact place where my mother had marched down the street in Milan, or in Mom, where is that? Milan? I can't hear you. Well, you'll tell me in a minute. I'm blanking on it suddenly. Anyway, when in 1948, later that year, a distant uncle agreed to sponsor my mother's family, and they came to the United States. My mother was 12 years old. She didn't speak a word of English. She had never been to school because the Holocaust started when she was right before she turned 5. And so she had never been to school. They wound up in the Bronx in New York, where my mother started 7th grade. She remembers the principal giving her a test saying, "You seem very smart. If you could keep up, that's great. And if not, you'll have to go back to kindergarten." So my mother was determined to keep up. She met friends. She actually enjoyed school. Her father was having a very hard time, though, finding work. He was religious. He didn't want to work on Saturdays. All the factories wanted him to work on Saturdays. So they ended up, when my mother finished middle school, moving to Chicago, where my grandfather thought he might go into business with his brother in a grocery business. So my mother moved to Chicago, went to high school in Chicago, and graduated from high school at 17 with the rest of her class. But while all her friends were going on to get jobs, go to college, get married, my mother found herself feeling very sad because she had not dealt with all of the trauma and tragedy that had happened to her as a child. Her father said, "You're not crazy, you don't need a psychiatrist," but my mother knew that she needed help. She found a psychiatrist on her own, and after a few months, she said she noticed again that the trees had leaves, that flowers had color. She told me, "I felt myself bending toward the sun." And that's how we got the title of the book, because it felt so hopeful. At 19, she met my father and they got married. There's a photo of that coming up. And that's my father. And on the left, she's dancing, my mother's dancing with her own father. And they got married. And 3 years later, I was born. And although I was a fairly curious, normal child, I felt different from a lot of the children I went to school with. You all know someone like this. I was the one who always wanted every sleepover at my house. I never wanted to go to camp. I never wanted to be far away from home. I felt guilty because I had so many of the things my mother had never had, like a mom or birthday parties or food when I was hungry. And I felt very determined to repair, to fix things, to repair the world. By the time I grew up, oh, that picture, by the way, not to tip my own sibling rivalry. I do have siblings. That's my sister and my brother when they were young. My mom had 3 kids, not just me. And so that's my whole family. I grew up, I went on to become a lawyer first, and then a television executive, and later a children's rights and human rights activist. And I was sure by the time I got married and had my own children that they would not have any of the same fears, separation anxiety that I had, because I thought I and my husband too were bridges between my mother's generation and my children. So I was so surprised when my children, but my daughter in particular, seemed to have so much of the same separation anxiety and fears that I had. As we started to write the book, we learned more about the ways that trauma gets transmitted from generation to generation. And we hope that hope also gets transmitted from generation to generation, which is why we wanted to write this book to begin with. We hope that the more people read stories like my mother's, learn about the Holocaust, that they're inspired, first of all, to become upstanders in their own right. We're very aware of the fact that the 4% of Polish people who helped Jewish people, who helped hide them, thousands and thousands of people survived because of those individuals. And the more we learn about the heroes of the Holocaust, the righteous Christians, the upstanders, the more we learn that those people were just normal people. They weren't necessarily straight A students or student body presidents or captains of football team. They were ordinary people who one day decided to do something good. And then they saw themselves as more heroic. And sometimes they went on to do great things because they decided to be an upstander one day. We hope that people journal and write their own stories, because every Holocaust survivor, first of all, has an amazing story to tell. But I would have had a much easier time writing my book if I had journaled more. We encourage you to ask relatives questions about their own lives while you have an opportunity to. And over the 9 years since we've written this book, countless people have come up to us everywhere across the country, throughout Europe, and said, I wish I had asked my uncle these questions while he was still alive. I wish I had asked this relative. So ask questions. And we hope that when we look at the world today, we're reminded how even Hitler came to power in a democracy, not unlike our democracy today. And little by little, he took away people's rights. And by the time people realized that, it was too late to fight back for them. So we learned through telling this story that democracies are really good at protecting the rights of the majority, right? The majority rules. But we all have to be on the lookout for the rights of minorities in our world. So thank you for listening to us. I think there's a few other, I think I skipped over probably a few photos. I could just talk you through them. I wanted to show you, this is a photo in 1967 when I was 7 years old. My mother's cousins, the three women who all hid in the attic together. Far left is my mother's cousin Miriam. That's my mother next. Then her cousin Lola, then her sister Sandra, and then her sister, well, that's Miriam, and on the other side was Sally. So that's my mother's cousins, and those are all their children, my cousins with my sister and brother, who all came on this trip in 1967. It was the first time I met these cousins. Our mother had hid in the attic together, and it was one of the first times I probably heard the word Holocaust. And then this was a photo of some of those same cousins. It's my sister. I'm all the way on the right. My sister's the one in the red striped shirt. And then those are four other cousins. We went back to Poland in 1998, helped one of my cousins make a documentary. And this is Ujovice, the town my mother was born in. And we could also link you to the documentary. That's Michaela and Gabe and my stepson, Chris, my three kids, and when they were little. And that's when our book came out, my mother, my daughter, Michaela, and me. Now we would love to answer your questions. Jill, should I start with this question that's in the chat box? Okay, so it looks like the first question is, how has the process of writing the book and speaking engagements that followed publication affected my mother's and my relationship and our relationship with my children, my mother's grandchildren? Mom, what would you say? How did writing the book, you should unmute now and just stay unmuted.
Yeah.
How did writing the book, in your opinion, affect our relationship and maybe your relationship with Gwen, David, and your grandkids?
Well, definitely my relationship with you, I can't say it's changed. It was always good, but there's a definite additional bond in our relationship, which I will always cherish. And although I have other bonds with my other children, so they're not left out. What else was the question?
And do you feel that it affected your relationship with your grandchildren?
With my grandchildren, no, I love my grandchildren. I'm very close to my grandchildren, and I would have been anyway.
Okay, and I would say pretty similarly. I think that it brought my mother and me. It added another dimension to our relationship. I was hesitant when we started writing the book. It wasn't my idea. I was at my mother's house one day, and she seemed frustrated because she wanted to tell her story and didn't quite know how to go about it. Friends had wanted to help her, and she didn't come across the right person. And I asked her why she wanted to write her book. And she told me that, first of all, she had heard about an increasing number of Holocaust deniers, like on the news. So she wanted to be a witness that the Holocaust really had occurred. She wanted to provide like testament and a memorial to her relatives who had died in the Holocaust. And finally, she told me she wanted to show that people could go through the worst experiences imaginable and not only survive, but survive well. So I was sort of moved by what she told me that day. And I said, well, maybe I could help you. And I always say, I don't think my mother heard me say maybe. So right away, she said, that's a great idea. When can we start? And that began our journey, like a 9-year journey from the time we started till the time our book was published, of writing this book. And the entire experience brought us closer together. But I would say the years since then, where we have just spoken to so many students and so many book groups and so many churches and synagogues, each one has been a wonderful and new experience and really gave us a partnership for the first time. My children, they were so young when we were writing this, so I don't know how it would have changed my relationship, but front and center throughout their whole lives was that they were survivors of a Holocaust survivor. And I think it gives them a certain strength. Each child has said to me at different times, I know they have faced their own challenges, and they have a sense, they look at my mother and they feel like they have survivor genes. They have survivor skills in their genes. Okay, there's a next question, which is, I think it's a question for me. What does your own experience investigating, reliving, and making meaning of your past traumas tell us generally about how to approach and heal trauma? What advice would you give to others on navigating this? For example, going toward the memories versus letting them go. How is the process best led toward completion? Well, I'll take a stab at this, and then Mom, you probably have ideas about this also. I guess I don't know the best way. I only know the way that I've done it. But what I would say is that the more I learned about my mother's past, the more I've become interested in her as a full dimensional human being, the more I've come to understand the Holocaust, which has given me so many tools for understanding so much of what goes on in the world today. There has been nothing that I have investigated, relived, or learned in this experience that I've been sorry that I know. There have been conversations with various relatives, especially when we were writing the book and I had to call up uncles and aunts and ask them about these horrible things that had happened 40 years earlier, 50 years earlier. And sometimes I thought every time I call them, I'm going to ruin their day. But I was surprised how happy people ended up feeling to be able to tell their stories. So I guess what my advice would be, take risks, try to learn as much as you can. I would never pressure a Holocaust survivor or anyone into talking about things that they're not yet ready to talk about. But it seems that if you listen with an open heart and open ears and really are there to want to learn, at least for me, I was surprised how many people wanted to speak with me. Mom?
Well, I had to find help because I went into a very deep depression because of my experiences as a young child. And I met a doctor, a regular doctor, and he recommended a psychiatrist to me. And that was my first experience with having getting some help. And I continued to get help, and eventually I began to feel as a whole person and not just a child survivor.
And in terms of the specific question about going toward memories or letting go, of course, that's more a question for my mom than for me. For me, I felt more like a detective. I wanted to learn everything I could learn about what happened to people who were so close to me before I was born. I think for my mother, she has told me she felt a weight off of her after she told me so much of her story. I think, Mom, right? You found it pretty life affirming. Is that right?
What?
In terms of like letting go of memories versus digging deeper.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. I give credit to writing the book, writing it with you, that it helped me to find more of myself than I had before.
The next question is, how can people see the documentary that I mentioned? The documentary is called Voices in the Attic. And I think you could just look it up online, and it should be pretty easy to find online. If not, you can always connect with the Museum of the Holocaust, and I could help you connect with it. But I know it's pretty easy to find. Voices in the Attic. It was produced by my cousin Debbie Goodstein and directed by her, and it has me, my sister, and all my cousins in it. And that was a question from Jill. This is a question from Beth Keen. When you were in the attic, did you think you would ever be able to leave? She's saying she can't imagine what it must have been like for you as a little girl to lose your mother and brother. How did you get through each day?
Painfully. I was always hungry. And when I did get food, I couldn't eat. I got sick to my stomach because I had eaten so little before. The whole experience was very painful, and not knowing when I was going to have a home, and having lost my mother and my brother, of course, that was the trigger of everything. And it was very difficult. There wasn't a happy moment for years of my life.
I'm continuing to read down the questions, and I want to tell you one, and I'm going to keep going right through the questions, but I wanted to tell you one side story in terms of what a small world this is. My mother, she's telling you how sad her life had been at that time in the attic. When they left their home in Poland after the war, she was pretty sure she never wanted to go back to her village again. And then when we wrote the book, we were asked to come back to Poland to speak in Warsaw and in Krakow. So we brought my mother back to her village to have a walk down the street and see her home. We got out of the van with my children, my husband, a friend, one of my best friends, Lynn, and an interpreter, and a 12-year-old girl walked by us on the street, and she said, "I know you," to me and my mom. And we thought, well, that can't be true. We're not, we don't live on this street. And it turned out that this village, Ujovice, had just celebrated its 600-year anniversary. And her teacher this 12-year-old girl's teacher had noticed that in all the celebrations, there had never been a mention of the Jewish families who had lived in the village before the war. So the teacher told this girl to write a report on the Jewish families. She had just interviewed the town historian, all the oldest people in the village, and her report had just won an award from the mayor. And at the center of her report was a picture of my mom and me. So here in this village that my mother had not returned to since she was 7 years old, there was a little girl who was doing a whole research report, and my mother was at the center. So it made us realize what a small world we're living in. Reading from this, my cousin Lauren Brenner sends her loves. We're sending our love back. The question is, I find children of survivors are driven and successful. Does that make sense? I have met a lot of children of Holocaust survivors who are driven and successful in terms of what they set out to do. I know in my case, I feel like I was always very aware that time could be limited. I mean, I'm optimistic and I hope to live a very long life, but the Holocaust was always there. So I always was aware that the world could end at any time. And so I felt that I should accomplish as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And I was also, I think, really aware that our world is pretty broken and that human beings could make a difference in it. So, you know, certainly my sister, my brother and I are very motivated and driven, my cousins too, and a lot of children of Holocaust survivors are. There's obviously a wide variety in children of Holocaust survivors, but I think that is, you know, one of the noted traits, absolutely. Mom, Gail Free says hi, she's listening from Connecticut, and she thank you for sharing your story. Great to see you virtually also, Gail. This is from Chaim Beliak, hi, and says, I read this book and it resonated with me, especially in its aspect of the multi-generational dimensions. Friends of Jewish Renewal in Poland, the progressive Jewish community hosted our family at Bet Warsaw in Warsaw, and Rabbi Beliak gave us great guidance and advice. He said, this is a powerful book, read it. So that's a rabbinical order to all of you. The next question, it's from a survivor who speaks at the museum. The question is, I believe your father was American. Did that help or hurt in the healing process of your mom? And then the question for my mom is, were you afraid to return to Poland? So my part of the answer is, my father was American. That is an accurate belief. And did it help or hurt in the healing process of my mom? Probably both. Mom, I should let you answer that question. I think for me, it helped me turn out a little more emotionally balanced than I might have been had I had two Holocaust survivor parents. That's my fantasy, at least. Mom, do you feel that marrying an American was helpful in your healing process?
Well, by the time I married an American, I felt I was American myself. So I was healing myself. And being married to an American, I think my husband was too sad to hear about my story. He knew it. He knew it. I told him in little bits, but it made him very sad to hear it.
And were you afraid to return to Poland when we went back?
I don't know if I was afraid. I didn't feel 100% comfortable walking down the street. I have to say that. Although it turned out okay, and I was glad I went, but I didn't have great memories.
Are there, okay. Are you finding that the experience of bonding with family during the pandemic with our safer at home restrictions is in any way similar to the kind of family bonding that occurred while hiding in the attic? Well, I'll answer that from my perspective. We are not hiding together. So my mother and I are not quarantined together. So I don't think that the bonding that I'm doing, my daughter is in law school and she is home here with her boyfriend. My son is working from home with his girlfriend. My husband is here. Our experience is in no way the way I imagine my mother's experience was in the Holocaust. We don't feel that, we're going to be shot when we walk out of our home, as my mother had felt for 2 years. In fact, one day when my mother was hiding in the attic, they could look out of a little hole in the window in the attic, and she actually saw two cousins, a father and daughter, running by the window and getting shot by Nazis right outside of the window where they were hiding in the farmhouse. So I don't think my experience is in any way similar to that, but certainly I think about my mother's experience, and it makes me feel, even though this is such a sad and horrible time, and so many people are either at risk of being sick or afraid of being sick or sick. So it's a terrible time, but to me, it doesn't rise to the same horrors as the Holocaust would have. But Mom, you're in your apartment, more isolated than I am. So does this remind you of your experience in the attic?
Yeah, the word quarantine makes me a little nervous because it reminds me of I have terrible memories about being quarantined. And also I have fears of being alone. I don't act on them, and I don't let it affect me anymore. But being alone is not my favorite thing.
Yeah. The next question is, in my own experience healing from trauma, I found that to connect compassionately, even with the perpetrators of the trauma, understanding them fully with all their flaws and foibles has been part of the healing process for me personally. How much room do you think there is for bringing understanding, forgiveness, and even embracing and compassion to that which we rightfully and conventionally consider to be evil? Mom, do you want to answer that first? So do you feel that compassion or forgiveness is part of the healing process for you?
Compassion for those who hurt, who were dangerous to us. No, I don't have compassion for those who threatened our lives.
Yeah.
And I can't think of anything. I can't think to say of anything good about that part of my life.
And people ask me about forgiveness, but I feel that it's not for me to forgive because I wasn't there. The trauma wasn't perpetrated against me. So I have a lot of compassion for people from those countries, descendants of perpetrators who had nothing to do with the evil. But I don't feel that it's my place to, and I don't feel forgiveness for the Nazis who killed 6 million Jews.
I have good feelings about Stasha Gracholski, and who, thank God for him. And he is mentioned in the Holocaust, in the
He's at
Yad
Vashem.
Vashem in Israel.
Yeah,
I'm very happy about that.
The next question is, what happened to other family members? For example, the infants that were given to the church. Have you ever had conversation with descendants of perpetrators about their inheritance as second generation as second generation to second generation. So first of all, in terms of the other family members, my mother's family tried to find the infants who were left at the church. They were told they didn't survive. They've tried multiple times to make sure that that is accurate. And very sadly, almost every family member who did not hide in the attic with my mother, aside from those 15 people, none of my mother's family survived. They were all shot in forests out in hiding, and did not survive. My mother's other grandparents and uncles and aunts. In terms of whether I've ever had conversations with descendants of perpetrators, interestingly, I think last year at the Boston Book Festival, I was asked to interview a woman who had just written a book. She was the granddaughter of a Nazi. She's a Swedish woman, and wrote a book, which I don't know why I'm blanking on the name. I'll pull it up here. And so we had a very interesting, great conversation. And we were asked in Los Angeles last year. She came to Los Angeles, and we did another book event together where we did talk second generation, I guess, to third generation, or maybe third generation, you could say, to third generation. And we really felt that that is the way forward, to understand each other. She had nothing to do with the Holocaust. She, in fact, her family had not been honest about it, never talked about it. And she spent many years after graduating from Wellesley College investigating this and learning what she could learn about her grandparents' past. And so I'm going to try to pull up this book and tell you, but we had a really interesting time. Okay, this is it here, but I don't see her. I'll find it.
My whole adult life has been guided by my grandmother's past.
Anyway, I will find it, and I'll find it in a minute, but let me ask other questions first. I think that President Bill Clinton was at a press conference one day, and a reporter asked him a question about what advice would you give my 12-year-old son to help him make the world better? And President Clinton said, have him get to know as many people as he can his age who are different from him. And to me, that is the way forward. Jewish people in the Holocaust who were more assimilated were more likely to be helped. Nazis commonly said, oh, those Jews, they're horrible, they're this, they're that, except for the one who lives next door to me. He's a good guy. And so there is, I think, an importance in us getting to know people with different pasts, different experiences, who look different from us, who seem different from us. They're really not that different from us. We all have much more in common than differences. Mom?
Can I interject something here?
Please.
What I know about Poland and what I remember is that Gentile neighbors were not very close to Jewish people, to Jewish neighbors. And there was a lot of fear going on. They would break into people's homes. And so I can't say that the Gentile people that stand out in my mind were loved Jewish people.
And the book I was referring to with the third generation granddaughter of a Nazi is called The Pendulum by Julie Lindahl. What were the DP camps like? This might be our last question. I'm not sure if we're running out of time. We're approaching the hour, but what were the DP camps like, Mom?
There were just kind of a waiting situation. We waited until we found a home, and there was food and there were people, friends, but it wasn't fancy. It was just makeshift rooms, and but it was better than the war.
Better than the war.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think that that is the end. I'm getting a sign that it is 1 o'clock. I will say that our book, Bending Toward the Sun, if you wanted, or Jill, do you want to, I think if you wanted a signed copy, you should let Jill or Beth or the Museum of the Holocaust know, and otherwise you could get unsigned copies more quickly, I guess, in this crazy time online if you want to read ahead of our ability to get signed books to you.
Yes, so the book, again, it's called Bending Toward the Sun. So Leslie and Rita have graciously offered to sign the book if anyone would like a signed copy. So you can send a message on Facebook to the museum, or you can email us at info@lamoth.org, and we'll arrange to get a signed copy to you. Otherwise, feel free to order it online or try one of your local booksellers. At least in Los Angeles, they're now offering curbside pickup, so I'm sure they would appreciate your business. Thank you so much, Leslie and Rita, for sharing your time and your incredibly moving family story with us. Leslie,
Thank you, ladies. Where's Beth?
Beth had to go.
Oh,
Beth had to
okay.
go. Rita, thank you for your bravery in revisiting such a difficult time in your life to share this with future generations. And Leslie, you do such a wonderful job bringing your family's story to life. Before we close, I want to let everyone know that while the museum is closed, our staff is working hard to provide meaningful and educational content like today's program. And next week, we will host 3 programs. On Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we'll hold a talk by Holocaust survivor Phil Rauscher. On Wednesday, May 20th, we are partnering with the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education and the Jewish History Museum in Tucson to prevent a conversation with Oregon artist Hank Pander and curator Bruce Gunther on how the arts contribute to our welfare, especially in difficult times like this. And on Thursday, May 21st, join us for a special talk by human rights activist Didine Umunyana, who was only 4 years old when she was separated from her family during the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsis. You can find more information about all of our events on this Facebook page and on our website, lamoth.org. Thank you again, Leslie and Rita, and thank you to everyone for watching. Please take care, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
We love being here. And thank you, Emmy Meyer, for helping us coordinate all of this.
And thank Marie. She was a big help.
And thank you, Marie, my mother's assistant, for helping make all of this possible too.
She sets it up. Yeah.